The Skinwalker Enigma, a novel by Your Name. Chapter 1, Echoes in the Stone. The Utah sky was a bruised purple, the last vestiges of daylight clinging to the jagged peaks of the Uintah Mountains. Down in the basin, the air grew cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and ancient dust. On the notorious property known as Skinwalker Ranch, the silence was a living thing, broken only by the rhythmic grinding groan of the industrial drill biting into the flank of the western mesa. Dr. Travis Taylor, astrophysicist, optical scientist, and unapologetic science fiction aficionado, leaned against the cold metal of a support truck, arms crossed over his chest. His official title on this bizarre project was Principal Investigator, a label that felt both absurdly formal and woefully inadequate. How does one principally investigate a phenomenon that seemed to actively defy investigation? Any movement, he called out to the drill operator, a man named Mike, whose face was perpetually etched with the patient skepticism of someone who gets paid by the hour, not by the anomaly. Mike spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the dusty ground. She's a hard layer, Doc, real hard. Travis sighed a plume of white vapor in the chilling air. For 5 long years, this team, a motley crew of scientists, engineers, and security specialists, funded by the enigmatic real estate magnate Brandon Fugel, had been chasing ghosts. Not literal ghosts. Travis drew a firm line at the supernatural, but ghosts in the machine, ghosts in the sky, and most maddeningly, ghosts in the ground. It had begun with local legends, whispers from the Ute tribe of a shape-shifting skinwalker, a malevolent spirit that haunted this 512-acre patch of land. Then came the stories from the previous owners, the Sherman family, who reported a nightmarish litany of horrors: UFOs, cattle mutilations, poltergeist activity, and giant wolf-like creatures with glowing red eyes that were impervious to bullets. The stories were so compelling, so utterly insane, that they attracted billionaire Robert Bigelow, who bought the ranch for his National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS. For years, Bigelow's team of PhDs studied the ranch in secret, eventually concluding, well, that's where the story got murky. They left, and the ranch fell silent again, until Brandon Fugel, a man with a lifelong fascination with the unexplained, purchased it with the express purpose of applying rigorous, transparent science to the mystery. And that's where Travis came in. He was the rigor, he was the science, at least that was the plan. The reality was a series of confounding, infuriating, and occasionally terrifying experiments. They'd launched rockets that were seemingly swallowed by the sky. They dug and found bizarre metal alloys that shouldn't exist. They'd seen unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, with their own eyes and tracked them on radar only to have them vanish in an instant. Tonight's effort was the culmination of years of groundwork. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys had painted a tantalizing picture, a massive, dense, vaguely metallic object estimated to be over 400 feet long, buried deep within the mesa. It was flanked by smaller, equally inexplicable anomalies. The official tongue-in-cheek nickname for the large object was the Worm. Travis privately thought of it as the Headache. "We're hitting something," Mike's voice crackled over the radio. "Something different. The drill's vibrating like a tuning fork." Travis pushed himself off the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. He joined Thomas Winterton, the ranch superintendent, and a man whose stoicism was as unshakable as the mesa itself. "Harder than granite," they're saying. Thomas murmured, his eyes fixed on the shuddering drill rig. The operation was painstaking. They were 470 feet horizontally into the mesa and about 100 feet deep, aiming for a point just above the main anomaly. The goal was to punch a borehole completely through the top of the mesa, creating a channel to later insert high-tech scanning equipment. But the mesa wasn't cooperating. Suddenly, the grinding sound changed, pitch a high-pitched scream that set Travis's teeth on edge. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the basin, and the drill went silent. What the hell was that, Travis asked. Broke the bit, Mike's voice grumbled over the comms. Again. An hour later, they were examining the spoils. The slurry of rock and water pumped out of the borehole was usually a monotonous gray sludge. But tonight, as they sifted through the muck under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, they found something else. It wasn't metal, not like the fragments they'd found before, alloys of magnesium, bismuth, and titanium that resembled heat shielding for a spacecraft. This was different. It was a small, flat, charcoal-colored fragment, no bigger than a thumbnail. "What is that, Ceramics?" asked Eric Bard, the ranch's principal data analyst, peering over Travis's shoulder. Travis turned the fragment over in his gloved fingers. It was unnaturally light. He ran a thumb over its surface. It was smooth, yet not. There was a texture to it, a subtle pattern he couldn't quite make out in the dim light. Get the field microscope. Under the portable lens, the pattern leaped into focus. It was a perfect crosshatch, a microscopic grid of interwoven fibers that seemed almost woven like an advanced composite material. "Travis, look at that," Eric whispered, his voice tight with excitement. "That's not natural. Mother Nature doesn't do right angles at the micron level." Travis felt a familiar thrill, a cocktail of scientific curiosity and a creeping sense of the uncanny that he'd come to associate with the ranch. "Let's check for radiation." He pulled a Geiger counter from his tool belt. The background count was normal, a lazy clicking of around 40 to 60 counts per minute. He passed the device over the rock, slurry the soil, his own boots. No change. Then he held it over the tiny ceramic fragment. The Geiger counter screamed. The digital display blurred as the number skyrocketed past 1000200, then maxed out its reading. It was an instantaneous localized spike of beta and gamma radiation. Instant, Eric breathed. "The hell is this stuff?" Travis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He had a PhD in astrophysics. He understood radiation. It decayed over time. It emanated from a source. It followed the inverse square law. It didn't just appear screaming at maximum intensity from a tiny inert-looking chip of what appeared to be ceramic. "I got chills, dude," Eric said, echoing Travis's thoughts. "We need to get this to a proper lab," Travis said, his voice low and urgent, "and I mean a real lab." 2 days later, Travis found himself in the sterile, climate-controlled basement of Utah Valley University, standing beside Dr. Brian Patchett, a physicist whose beard was as wild as his passion for material science. The fragment, now secured on a small aluminum stub, was inside the vacuum chamber of a scanning electron microscope SEM, a machine capable of magnifying objects up to 1,000,000 times their actual size by bombarding them with a focused beam of electrons. "Shouldn't take too long," Dr. Patchett said, his fingers dancing over a complex array of controls. "She's been running fairly quickly today." The lights in the lab were dimmed, and the only sounds were the hum of the SEM's vacuum pump and the quiet whirring of its cooling fans. On a large monitor, a grayscale image began to resolve. "Here we go," Patchett murmured. The surface of the fragment filled the screen. It was an alien landscape of peaks and valleys, but overlaying it all was the unmistakable, perfectly geometric crosshatch pattern. "Oh, you can see the crosshatch pattern in it," Travis said, leaning closer. "That doesn't look like Mother Nature." "No, it doesn't," Patchett agreed, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm going to reposition this a little, zoom in on one of these intersection points." He manipulated a joystick, and the image on the screen shifted. The electron beam focused on a small, dark pore in the material's surface. As they watched, something impossible happened. "Are those holes getting bigger?" Travis asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I think so," Patchett replied, his own voice laced with disbelief. It was undeniable. The tiny pore on the screen was visibly expanding, opening up like a microscopic iris. Then another next to it began to open, and another. The entire surface was becoming more porous, the structure itself seeming to unravel before their eyes. "Holy crap. Look at that," Travis exclaimed, pointing at the screen. "What if it's the electron beam? What if the energy from the microscope is causing this?" It was a plausible hypothesis. High-energy electron beams could certainly cause changes in sensitive materials. "Let's test it," Patchett said, his scientific instincts overriding his shock. "Let's turn off the beam and see if it goes back to normal." He flipped a switch. The image on the screen froze a static snapshot of the porous surface. They waited in silence for a minute, the hum of the machinery suddenly feeling loud and oppressive. "Okay," Patchett said, turning it back on. He reactivated the beam. A new live image materialized on the screen. Both men gasped. The pores were gone. The surface was smooth and solid again, the crosshatch pattern pristine and unbroken. That does not look as porous as it was. Travis stated, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Not nearly," Patchett said, already pulling up the previous screen capture for comparison. He placed the two images side by side. The difference was stark. One was pockmarked and open, the other was solid and whole. "This stuff is fixing itself," Travis said, the words feeling inadequate. "Yes," Patchett breathed, staring at the screen. "It's healing. That's exactly right. I have never in my 30 years of material science seen anything capable of doing this. This violates several known principles of thermodynamics. Unbelievable, Travis said, running a hand through his hair. What the hell is in that mesa? The implications were staggering. A self-healing material, a technology so advanced it bordered on magic. And it had been buried for who knows how long deep inside a rocky mesa on a patch of land in rural Utah that the locals claimed was cursed. The headache, Travis thought, was just getting started. Chapter 2, The Invisible Dome. The new season of investigation began as it always did, with a palpable sense of nervous energy. The team reassembled at the ranch's command center, a state-of-the-art facility they'd christened the Advanced Research Center, or ARC. It was a far cry from the cramped makeshift offices of previous years. Now a bank of monitors displayed real-time data from a network of sensors spread across the property, magnetometers, radiation detectors, RF spectrum analyzers, and a new system of ground-penetrating radar arrays designed by security expert Jim Royston and his colleague Sam Durso. "Gentlemen, it is so great to see you," Brandon Fugel said, his enthusiasm filling the room. He had flown in by helicopter, landing on the helipad just outside. "I'm excited to launch this next chapter." Travis looked around at the faces of his team. Eric Bard, his fingers already flying across a keyboard, analyzing atmospheric pressure data. Thomas Winterton, standing silently by the door, his presence a quiet and steadying force. Jim Royston, a man whose calm demeanor belied a mind that thought in terms of military-grade strategy and technological countermeasures. This was their forward operating base in a war against the unknown. "We've never been this prepared," Travis said, and he meant it. The ARC was their fortress of logic, a place to store and process the millions of data points the ranch threw at them every day. I don't think anyone's ever been this prepared to do this kind of investigation. The first order of business was the mesa. As we all know, Thomas began a rare smile touching his lips. We were finally able to punch up through the top of the mesa. A small cheer went through the room. It had been a monumental effort. "The plan is to drill a second borehole on the other side of the anomaly," Thomas continued. "Once we have two, we can insert scanning devices and hopefully get a real picture of what's in there." "Good," Travis said. "Every time we go into that mesa, we bring something out that doesn't belong. The self-healing ceramic is just the latest example." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the team. "But we've got things below and above. Last year, we detected something strange. A barrier." This was the second major focus of the new season. The triangle. A triangular patch of land in the center of the ranch that was by all metrics the epicenter of the high strangeness. It was where they recorded the most energy spikes, the most bizarre radio frequency signals, and the most UAP sightings. It was where they had seen a strange amorphous blob anomaly appear on camera, and where Jim Royston's infrared LiDAR drone had detected a circular ring with a black void in the center, a structure eerily similar to theoretical illustrations of a wormhole. But the most compelling piece of data had come late in the previous season. A laser beam aimed across the property had been inexplicably cut off, as if by an invisible wall, at an altitude of nearly 2,000 feet. At the same time, a technologist named Pete Kelsey, who was running a terrestrial LiDAR scanner, detected a massive, invisible, cone-shaped anomaly centered perfectly on the triangle. In the ARC, Travis walked over to a large holographic display. With a few keystrokes, he brought up a 3D model. "This is a construct I built based on Pete Kelsey's laser scanner data," he said. A wireframe cone shimmered in the air. "When we first saw this, we thought, well, maybe it's a cone. But look at the curvature. He rotated the model. That looks like a dome or a bubble to me." Radius of about 610 meters. A low whistle went through the room. A 610-meter radius bubble. An invisible dome of energy or distorted space over a kilometer in diameter sitting over the heart of the ranch. So the question is, Travis continued his voice, electric with the thrill of the chase. How do we interact with it? Can we measure its thickness? Is it an optical distortion? Does it affect instrumentation? He turned to Brandon. "I think we should take a helicopter fly right through it." Brandon's eyes lit up. "Let's go to work." The experiment was ambitious and complex. Cameron Fugel, Brandon's brother and an experienced pilot, would fly the helicopter. Pete Kelsey would be on board operating a handheld LiDAR scanner to map the dome's boundaries in real time. The helicopter would also broadcast a constant, clean radio signal at 1.2 gigahertzes, a frequency chosen by Eric because it was unlikely to be contaminated by other sources. Eric and Travis would monitor that signal from the ground, looking for any deviation or interference as the helicopter passed through the dome's inferred boundary. On the ground at the dead center of the triangle, an expert geomatics engineer named Irene Radcliffe would operate 2 more terrestrial LiDAR scanners, providing a stationary baseline. Caleb, another technician, would be stationed on a nearby hill, and Thomas would be tracking the helicopter's speed with a radar gun. They were going to throw every sensor they had at this invisible wall in the sky. As they set up, Travis felt the familiar pre-experiment jitters. This was real science. Form a hypothesis there is an invisible dome and design an experiment to test it. But this was Skinwalker Ranch, where the experiment often seemed to test them back. Eric, this is Caleb, the radio crackled. We're set up over here in the east field. Ready to go. Copy you, Caleb. Eric's voice replied from the Ark. We're ready to start. Travis stood with Irene in the triangle. The air was still. The only sound was the distant whomp 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 of the helicopter's blades as it lifted off. Hey Pete, can you turn on the 1.2 gigahertz signal? Eric's voice requested. On Travis's spectrum analyzer, a clean, sharp spike appeared at exactly 1.2 gigahertzes. I see a 1.2 signal big time on the helicopter, Travis confirmed. The helicopter, a small black speck against the vast blue sky, began its first pass from west to east at a low altitude of 120 feet. Hey Eric, Jim Royston's voice cut in from the Ark, an unusual urgency in his tone. I'm starting to see some weird anomaly behavior at the triangle. The GPS tracker on my drone, which is just sitting here on the ground, is lighting up with red points. Data corruption errors. We're seeing this before the experiment even really starts. Travis asked into his radio, looking around the empty field. Yeah, Jim confirmed. It's like the ranch knows we're about to poke it. The helicopter approached the invisible boundary. On his monitor, Travis watched the data stream from Pete's handheld LiDAR. It was clean, mapping the terrain below with perfect precision. Okay, passing through the dome boundary, Cameron the pilot announced calmly, coming up on the triangle. The moment the helicopter's icon on the GPS map crossed into the airspace directly above Travis and Irene, the LiDAR data feed on Travis's tablet flickered. A series of red dots appeared on the screen. Did you see that Travis said to Irene, positional errors, data corruption, right over our heads? It's happening again, Eric's voice said in his earpiece. One after another, the interruptions are occurring in a specific location, right above the triangle. It was too perfect to be a coincidence. Outside the dome, the data was flawless. The instant it entered, and specifically when it was over the triangle, the high-tech equipment glitched. Okay, we're on the east side of the dome, Cameron reported, turning around to come back to the west. As the helicopter made its return pass, the same thing happened. Red error points blossomed on the screen the moment it flew over the triangle. It was reproducible. Then something even stranger occurred. Travis was watching his spectrum analyzer when a second spike appeared on the screen, nestled right beside the first one. It was also at 1.2 gigahertzes. Check this out, he said into his radio, his heart starting to pound. I'm picking up a different 1.2 gigahertz signal. I should only be seeing the one on the helicopter. What is this? Eric's voice came back baffled. I see it too. It's a ghost signal. It just appeared out of nowhere. It was as if something inside the dome had detected their broadcast frequency, perfectly mimicked it, and was now transmitting it back at them. It was playing tag. What in the hell could do that? Travis muttered. He cranked up the audio output for the new signal. A strange, warbling, digital-sounding chirp filled his headphones. It was a sound he'd heard before a year ago from a mysterious signal they detected in the East Field. It sounded like two things talking to each other. With every pass Cameron made at 120 feet, the results were the same. GPS errors and data corruption directly over the triangle, and the mysterious ghost signal chirping away on the radio frequency spectrum. Travis is requesting 400 feet, Eric relayed to the helicopter. Roger, going up to 400, Cameron replied. They needed to know if the effect had a ceiling. As the helicopter climbed and repeated its flight path, the impossible continued. Look, it's happening again, Eric said from the Ark as another cluster of red error points appeared on the LiDAR feed right over the triangle. It's like the data is disappearing into a void. The pattern was undeniable. It wasn't just a random field of interference. It was a column, a vertical cylinder of something rising directly from the triangle, causing sophisticated electronics to fail. Hey guys, be advised, Caleb's voice crackled from the east field. We have good, strong comms with him until he gets directly over the triangle. Then his transmission becomes so garbled we can't understand him. We're looking at a column of influence, Travis said, thinking aloud, projecting straight up from the ground. They sent the helicopter higher. 1,000 feet. 2,000 feet. The results were the same. The moment the aircraft entered the invisible dome, Jim Royston's drone controller, which was tracking the helicopter's GPS, would light up with error messages. The moment it flew out, the errors would vanish. The effect was as sharp and defined as a brick wall. Something's flying by the helicopter. Pete Kelsey's voice suddenly announced from the air, a note of alarm in it. Say again, Pete, Travis asked. Just saw something. Small, white, fast, zipped right past my window. Travis's blood ran cold. White orbs. They had seen them before, often in conjunction with equipment, malfunctions, and strange signals. Was it connected? Was the dome some kind of hangar? A gateway? After nearly 2 hours of flying, they called an end to the experiment. The helicopter landed and the team began to pack up their gear. The ghost signal at one point, 2 gigahertz, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The moment the stimulus, the helicopter's broadcast, was removed, the response from the ranch ceased. It was more than just supportive evidence. It was in Travis's mind a slam dunk. The dome was real. They had mapped its boundary through repeated reproducible equipment failure. They had detected an intelligent mimic signal from within it. And they had a visual confirmation of an anomalous object in its vicinity. They were in a bubble. And they had just figured out how to knock on its walls. The question now was what lived inside. Chapter 3, The Subterranean Sphere. The debrief in the Ark was charged with an electric tension. Brandon and Cameron joined via video conference, their faces filling one of the large monitors. Before we even get into the data, Pete Kelsey began, I need to talk about what I saw. Something went zipping right by me. Eric pulled up footage from a high-speed camera he'd mounted to the helicopter's landing skid. He scrubbed through the video and then froze it. There, suspended in the air just below the helicopter, was a small, perfectly spherical white object. Seems pretty spherical to me, Travis observed, leaning toward the screen. Not a bird, not a drone. I've seen these before, Cameron said from the monitor. That's similar to what I've seen flying around the helicopter on other occasions. It was another piece of the puzzle. The orbs, the signals, the dome, they were all connected, all part of the same complex interacting system. Okay, Travis said, let's look at the LiDAR data, the errors. He brought up his 3D model again and began plotting the coordinates of every single data corruption event from the flight. As he added the points from the 120-foot pass, then the 400-foot pass, and then the 1000 and 2000-foot passes, a stunning pattern emerged. The red error points formed a perfectly vertical column rising from the ground like an invisible skyscraper with a triangle at its base. I'm seeing a column, Eric said, stating the obvious. And that column is at the dead center of the dome, Travis added. This is where the blob destroyed the rocket. This is where Jim got the LiDAR data of the wormhole. This is where the laser was cut off at 2000 feet. He turned to face the others. Something is physically, demonstrably there. Then Pete Kelsey, the quiet technologist, dropped the bombshell. So he said, clearing his throat, I post-processed the data from Irene's terrestrial laser scanners, the ones that were sitting in the triangle during the experiment. He shared his screen, and a new 3D model appeared. It showed the ground level of the triangle. But below it, shimmering in virtual space, was another dome, an inverted dome extending deep underground. This is a dome that's underground, Pete said, his voice flat with awe. 300 meters deep. It's a mirror image of the one in the sky. The room fell silent. Travis stared at the screen, his mind racing. It wasn't a dome, it was a sphere. A massive, invisible bubble of energy or distorted space-time, more than half a kilometer in diameter, centered on the triangle, extending equally above and below the ground. They weren't just on the ranch. They were inside the anomaly. I feel like we're in a bubble here, Thomas Winterton said, his voice a low rumble. You're right, Thomas Travis replied, the full implication of the discovery washing over him. There could be a huge bubble that goes above and below the ground. We just made a huge breakthrough. But there was one more piece of data, one so bizarre, it seemed to defy all explanation. Pete zoomed in on his model of the subterranean dome. Floating in the space above it at about 30 feet in the air were 2 small blue icons. What are those little blue things, Travis asked. That's where the scanner thinks the scanners were, Pete said. What do you mean, thinks? Those are the reported GPS positions of Irene's 2 LiDAR scanners, Pete explained, the scanners that were sitting on tripods on the ground. But the model shows them floating 30 feet in the air, Eric pointed out. Correct, Pete said. Travis's jaw tightened. 30 feet, he whispered. That's a hell of an interesting number. That is the exact altitude where the blob anomaly appeared and where our rocket exploded. The phenomenon wasn't just creating a bubble, it was manipulating space and data within it. It was making stationary objects on the ground report their position as being 30 feet in the air at a location of previously documented extreme weirdness. We need to look through the wall of this bubble, Travis said, his mind already designing the next experiment. We need to find out what's triggering it. The team agreed. The investigation of the bubble would become the driving force of their work. Their next attempt to probe the bubble was a high-tech fireworks display. The plan was to use a swarm of 200 GPS-guided drones provided by a company called Sky Elements to map the bubble's interior. The first swarm of 100 drones would fly in a cone formation over the triangle, equipped with pyrotechnics that would emit smoke and sparks. The hope was that the smoke would be contained by the bubble's invisible wall, giving them a visual outline. The second swarm of 200 drones would form a large hollow cylinder also over the triangle. Once it was in place, Travis would fire one of his custom-built rockets straight up the middle, loaded with sensors and cameras, to see how the bubble reacted to a high-speed projectile. As night fell and the team prepared, the ranch began its old tricks. Eric, look at this, Travis said, pointing to his spectrum analyzer. We're getting a 1.2 gigahertz signal again, the ghost signal. And I've got multiple spikes at 1.6 gigahertz, Eric added. That's a protected military satellite band. We've seen that right before UAP sightings. The signals were coming from the direction of the triangle. The bubble was active. It knew they were there. We're starting the drone takeoff now, the lead from Sky Elements announced. 100 points of light lifted into the night sky, a mesmerizing silent ballet. They ascended and began to move into their cone formation. On the Sky Elements team's monitor, the GPS plot showed the drones converging perfectly over the center of the triangle. But with their own eyes, Travis and the team could see something was wrong. Hey, Thomas, Travis said into his radio. They are not over the triangle. They're way off to the east. Confirmed that Thomas's voice came back. They're over the road to the south field. On the GPS display, the drones were exactly where they were supposed to be. In reality, they were a good 40 meters off target. The bubble was spoofing their GPS, feeding the drones' navigation systems false location data and forcing them to miss their mark. They triggered the pyrotechnics anyway. A beautiful shower of sparks rained down, but it was in the wrong place. The smoke drifted away on the breeze, revealing nothing. They launched the second swarm, the 200 drone cylinder. The same thing happened. The GPS insisted they were centered over the launch pad in the triangle. Visually, they were clearly off to the east. It doesn't matter, Travis decided. I'm launching the rocket. It's close enough. He armed the rocket and hit the launch button. With a roar and a flash of light, the rocket shot into the sky, heading for the northern wall of the drone cylinder. Look at that, someone shouted. As the rocket ascended, a bright, distinct orb of light flew into the frame, paced the rocket for a split second, and then vanished. Did you see that? Travis yelled. It flew right by the rocket. The rocket continued its ascent, its light blinking. It reached its apogee, and then the light vanished. It simply winked out of existence. Where'd it go? Thomas asked. I don't see a chute. Seconds passed. Then the light reappeared hundreds of feet away from where it had vanished. It was falling fast, a lawn dart. No parachute had deployed. The rocket had been teleported or hidden from view for several crucial seconds, preventing its recovery system from activating. It was another casualty of the bubble. Later reviewing the high-speed footage, they found more anomalies. A strange, black, well-defined object, not a drone, falling through the frame. Another fast-moving light that zipped across half the sky in a single frame, far too fast to be a plane or satellite. Pete Kelsey's LiDAR scans from that night confirmed it all. The bubble was there. The peak of the dome above ground registered at exactly 2,000 feet. They had poked the bubble, and the bubble had poked back, demonstrating a level of technological control that was deeply unsettling. It could manipulate GPS cloak objects and project energy fields. The drilling at the mesa had also run into the bubble's influence. The drill team's beacon, a sophisticated piece of equipment needed to track the drill bit underground, repeatedly failed to sync with its controller. It would only work when they drove it physically outside the 610-meter radius of the bubble. The moment they drove back inside, it would fail. All the while, the 1.2 and 1.6 gigahertz signals would spike on the spectrum analyzer with the 2 gigahertz signal originating from the triangle and the 1.6 gigahertz signal seeming to emanate from inside the mesa itself. It was as if the two locations were communicating, linked by the bubble. It's a symbiotic relationship Travis theorized during a late-night session in the Ark. The object in the mesa might be the power source, and the bubble over the triangle is the projection, the interface. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thought. They weren't just dealing with a haunted patch of ground, they were dealing with a vast, intelligent, and invisible machine. So what's next? Brandon Fugel asked, his face a mixture of wonder and concern. How do we get a better look at this thing? Thomas Winterton, ever the pragmatist, had an idea. The pyro was good, but it only lasted for seconds, he said. What if we just put some big bonfires in the center of the triangle? A lot of heat, a lot of smoke for a long period of time. Let's see what the smoke does when it hits that 2,000-foot ceiling. Travis grinned. It was beautifully simple. Low-tech against high-tech. I love it, he said. Let's put thermal energy into the space. Let's smoke this thing out. As the team planned their next most audacious experiment, the mystery of Skinwalker Ranch deepened. The self-healing ceramic, the object in the mesa, and the invisible sphere were all pieces of the same impossible puzzle. They were standing on the threshold of a discovery that could rewrite humanity's understanding of physics, technology, and its place in the universe. And all they had to do was walk through the wall of an invisible bubble, not knowing if it was a cage, a gateway, or something else entirely. Chapter 4, Smoke and Mirrors. The following morning, a different kind of energy pulsed across the ranch. The high-tech hum of LiDAR scanners and spectrum analyzers was replaced by the guttural roar of a front-end loader and the rhythmic thud of axe on wood. Thomas Winterton was in his element, orchestrating the construction of 3 massive pyres in the heart of the triangle, his quiet competence a stark contrast to the esoteric nature of their mission. Travis watched a wry smile on his face. You know, he said to Eric, who was setting up high-speed and thermal cameras at a safe distance for all our PhDs and multi-million-dollar sensor arrays, we've resorted to the most ancient form of inquiry, building a giant fire and seeing what happens. Sometimes the simplest solution is the most elegant, Eric replied, not looking up from his viewfinder. And besides, we're still pointing every sensor we have at it. We're just giving them something new to look at. A known variable in an equation full of unknowns. While the bonfire experiment was being prepared, activity resumed at the mesa. The drilling operation, plagued by the bubble's interference, was at a critical juncture. The plan was to re-enter the first borehole, widen it, and then finally drill the second hole on the opposite side of the anomaly they called the worm. Before they could begin reaming the hole, however, they needed to inspect its integrity. Josh Halpern, a technician with a knack for wrangling stubborn equipment, was tasked with feeding a specialized borehole camera, a snake cam on a 400-foot armored cable, up into the dark channel. Let's get on it, Travis said, joining the drill team at the mouth of the borehole. The air was cool at the base of the mesa, the rock face looming over them like a silent stone titan. The first 150 feet were uneventful. The camera's light cut a clean circle through the darkness, the rough-hewn walls of the borehole scrolling by on the monitor. Then, at the 200-foot mark, the image flickered. Back up, Travis said, pointing at the screen. What is that? Clinging to the wall of the hole was a glob of something translucent and green. It had the consistency of gelatin, and it seemed to pulse faintly in the camera's light. That's more of that green jelly, the driller, Mike grunted. Saw some of that in the spoils pile last year. Travis remembered. They had found a small amount of the substance, and lab analysis had been bizarre. It contained fragments of burnt plant material fused at a microscopic level with trace elements of rare earth metals that had no business being there. Finding it in situ 200 feet deep inside solid rock was another level of strange. Keep pushing, Travis urged. As the camera continued its ascent, the video feed suddenly cut to black. What we lose the picture? Thomas asked, stepping closer. Battery still good, Josh confirmed, checking his console. Something's interfering with the signal. Travis's eyes narrowed. 200 feet in. That's the exact spot where the drill beacon failed over and over last year. It was a nexus of interference, a point in space where the laws of electromagnetism seemed to get a vote, not a veto. A moment later, the picture snapped back on clear as day. It's like we passed through a boundary, Josh said, his voice hushed. The rest of the borehole was clear. The hole had held its integrity. All right, let's roll her back out of there, Thomas instructed. Time to see if we can suck some of that green stuff out. They brought in a powerful vacuum truck, attaching a long hose to the drill pipe. With a deafening roar, the vacuum switched on, pulling slurry and debris from the depths of the hole. When they inspected the contents of the truck's tank, they were met with another surprise. Amidst the gray sludge, they found no trace of the green jelly. But they did find something else. Well, Thomas said, picking a thin black fragment from the sieve. What do you make of this? He handed it to Travis. It was smooth, obsidian black, and wafer thin. It reminded him of flint or shale, but it had a strange, almost metallic sheen. It was nothing like the surrounding sandstone of the mesa. Much to our surprise, Travis said, holding the fragment up to the light, we're seeing materials that don't appear to be native to the mesa at all. First, the radioactive self-healing ceramic. Now this. It was like an archaeological dig into an alien technology. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the basin, all eyes turned to the triangle. The three pyres, each 10 feet high, stood like pagan offerings in the center of the field. All right, people, Travis announced over the radio, taking his position at the command forward post. We are ready to go. Light them up. Thomas and his team moved in with torches. The dry wood caught quickly, and within minutes, 3 pillars of flame roared into the twilight sky, merging into a single massive column of fire and heat. The thermal cameras flared white, and the sound was a deep, hungry roar that seemed to shake the very ground. For an hour, they let the fires burn, feeding them more wood, pouring thermal energy into the base of the invisible bubble. The heat was immense, creating a visible shimmer in the air for 100 yards in every direction. Eric's sensors were in overdrive, collecting data on temperature, radiation, magnetic fields, and radio frequencies. Okay, Phase 2, Travis commanded. Douse them. Let's make some smoke. A fire truck brought in for the experiment moved to the edge of the inferno and began spraying the pyres with a high-pressure hose. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The roaring flames were replaced by an explosive billow of thick white smoke and steam which surged upwards in a massive churning column. The wind was calm. The smoke rose almost perfectly straight up a thick, opaque pillar against the darkening sky. It's rising. Eric reported his eyes glued to a monitor, tracking the smoke's altitude with a laser rangefinder. 500 feet, 10,000 feet. 1,500 feet. The team watched in breathless silence. This was it, the ultimate litmus test. If the bubble was real, if it had a physical or energetic barrier at its peak, the smoke should be affected. It should flatten out, spread, or be deflected. Coming up on 2,000 feet, Eric said, his voice tight. On the monitor, the number ticked over. 1950. 1980. 2000. The column of smoke hit the 2,000 foot mark and kept going. 2,100 feet. 2,200 feet. It continued to rise slowly, dissipating into the upper atmosphere, utterly unimpeded. There was no ceiling, no barrier, no dome. A wave of disappointment washed over Travis. Nothing he said, slumping back in his chair. The smoke went straight through. The LiDAR data from last week showed a distinct barrier at 2,000 feet. Tonight, it's not there. Maybe it's not always on Eric suggested. Think about it. A force field of that size would take an immense amount of power. It's possible it only activates when something interacts with it. Our helicopter was a stimulus. The drones were a stimulus. A column of smoke, maybe that's not enough to trigger the defense system. It was a sound theory, but it was also unfalsifiable, the kind of reasoning that drove a hard-nosed scientist like Travis crazy. As they were packing up deflated, a call came over the radio from Jim Royston, who had been monitoring the skies with a high-end thermal imaging drone. "Travis, you need to see this," Jim's voice said, crackling with an excitement that was rare for him. "I've got something on thermal right above the triangle where the smoke was." Travis and Eric hurried over to Jim's station. On the thermal monitor, the dissipating smoke showed up as a faint, warm haze. But within that haze, a distinct shape was visible. It was a perfect cold black circle, a hole in the thermal landscape. It was sharply defined, stationary, and utterly out of place. It looks like there's a heat source right above us, one of the technicians had said during a previous experiment. This was the opposite. It was a cold spot, a void. That's the wormhole signature, Travis breathed, recognizing the pattern from Jim's previous LiDAR data. It wasn't the smoke. The heat from the fire must have been the stimulus. It made the anomaly visible on thermal. The bonfire hadn't been a failure. It had revealed another facet of the phenomenon. The bubble wasn't a simple static shell. It was a dynamic, multi-layered system that could shift its properties, sometimes appearing as a hard wall to LiDAR and GPS, other times as a thermal void. Their low-tech experiment had yielded high-tech results. The ranch had once again taken their expectations and turned them inside out. They hadn't smoked out the bubble, but they had captured a stunning image of the portal-like anomaly at its heart, a cold, dark doorway hanging silently in the Utah sky, waiting for someone or something to pass through. The question of what lay on the other side was more pressing and more terrifying than ever. Chapter 5, The Telltale Signal. The image of the thermal void lingered in the minds of the team long after the embers in the triangle had cooled. In the sterile confines of the Ark, the perfect cold circle was frozen on the main monitor, a stark black hole against the ghostly gray of the dissipating smoke. It was a photograph of an absence, a picture of something that was defined only by what it was not. So let's recap, Travis said, pacing before the screen. We have an invisible structure, a sphere over a kilometer in diameter that appears to be centered on the triangle. This structure can physically impede, or at least interfere with our technology, as evidenced by the LiDAR and GPS failures. It can generate its own mimicked RF signals. And now we know that at its core, it can manifest as a thermally null region, a cold spot, when stimulated with enough heat. He stopped and turned to the team. This isn't a simple barrier. It's a reactive, multimodal system. It changes its properties based on how we interact with it, which makes it devilishly difficult to study Eric Bard added from his console. We're trying to measure a shadow that changes shape depending on where you shine the light. The discussion continued for hours, a whirlwind of theoretical physics and engineering pragmatism. Was the bubble a product of negative energy, a localized warp in space-time that absorbed thermal radiation? Was the object in the mesa the power source projecting the field? The questions were as vast and unsettling as the Utah sky. It was Brandon Fugel joining via video link who brought them back to Earth. The bubble is a profound discovery, he said, his voice resonating with both excitement and impatience. But we cannot forget the hard target. We have a 400-foot-long anomaly buried in that mesa, and we are bringing out physical materials that defy known science. We must press forward. What is the status of the drilling? The question hung in the air. All eyes turned to Thomas Winterton. The Beacon Thomas said simply, "We can't drill if we can't track the drill head, and the beacon is unreliable at the drill site. We know this." "We suspect it's the bubble's influence," Travis clarified, "but we haven't proven it conclusively." He saw the path forward instantly, a clear, simple experiment to test the hypothesis. That's what we do next. We take the beacon out for a drive. The following afternoon, Travis found himself in the passenger seat of a pickup truck with Thomas at the wheel. In his lap, he held the drill beacon's controller. The beacon itself, a yellow torpedo-shaped device, was in the truck bed. Their destination was a nondescript patch of dirt and sagebrush exactly 700 meters from the center of the triangle, well outside the bubble's inferred boundary. They stopped the truck and Travis powered on the controller. Okay, attempting to sync the beacon, he pressed a button. A moment later, a green light flashed on the screen. Linked up, first try. Signal strength is 100%. Just as it should be, Thomas noted his face impassive. "All right," Travis said, a nod of anticipation tightening in his stomach. "Let's go back slowly, and I want you to call out the moment my signal starts to drop." Thomas put the truck in gear and began to drive back towards the mesa and the drill site. The journey was silent, the only sound the crunch of tires on the dirt road. Travis's eyes were locked on the signal strength indicator on his controller. It remained pegged at 100%. They passed the 650-meter mark, then 620. "We're right at the edge of the bubble, right here," Travis said, his voice low. "Entering now." The instant he finished his sentence, the signal strength bar on the controller flickered. It dropped from 100% to 80%, then shot up to 95%, then plunged to 40%. "It's bouncing wildly," Travis announced, his scientific detachment warring with a profound sense of awe. "The moment we crossed that line." Signals kind of bouncing all over again, the driller's voice confirmed over the radio from the drill site where he was monitoring a separate receiver. As they drove deeper into the bubble's radius, the signal became more and more erratic until, as they pulled up to the drill rig, it disconnected completely. A red light blinked on the controller, link failed. "That's just unbelievable," Travis breathed. He looked at Thomas, whose stony expression had been replaced by one of grudging wonder. They had just driven through an invisible wall that affected technology as surely as a physical barrier. It wasn't a malfunction, it was a feature of the environment. Despite the definitive proof of interference, the decision was made to try and proceed. The drillers needed to enlarge the existing borehole by attaching a wider reaming bit and pulling it back down from the top of the mesa. But first, they had to get the original drill bit back up there. And to do that, they needed a stable link with the beacon. As the crew powered up the drill rig, Eric's voice crackled over the radio from the Ark. "Travis, you're not going to believe this." "Try me," Travis sighed. "We are simultaneously getting a 1.2 gigahertz signal and a 1.6 gigahertz signal. We are not broadcasting anything, so this is coming from somewhere else." Travis checked his own handheld spectrum analyzer. There they were, two clean, sharp spikes of energy that had appeared out of nowhere the moment they'd started the drill. "I'm going to triangulate the source," he said, grabbing a directional antenna. He walked a wide arc around the drill site, pointing the antenna, watching the signal strength. The results were immediate and unambiguous. "Eric, do you copy that 1.2 gigahertz signal is coming from the triangle from the center of the bubble?" "Copy that," Eric replied. "And I'm getting a fix on the 1.6. It looks like it's coming from inside the mesa." Travis froze. The two primary hotspots on the ranch were in communication. The bubble and the object buried in the rock were talking to each other, a silent digital conversation sparked by the team's attempt to drill. And their conversation was actively preventing the work from proceeding. For the rest of the day, the drillers fought a losing battle. They would manage to get the beacon to sync for a few moments, only to have it drop out as soon as they began to advance the drill. It was an exercise in pure frustration. They were being technologically jammed by an invisible, intelligent system. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, a defeated Mike shut down the drill rig. "We can't work like this," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "If we get back in the morning and this thing isn't calibrated, we're just wasting time." Travis nodded, the disappointment a bitter taste in his mouth. "You're right. Let's break it down for the night." He stood for a long time after the crew had left the massive, silent drill rig silhouetted against the twilight. He looked from the dark, imposing face of the mesa towards the empty, innocuous-looking field they called the Triangle. He felt like a biologist who had spent years studying an animal in its natural habitat, only to suddenly realize the habitat itself was the animal. They weren't just investigating strange events on Skinwalker Ranch. They were inside a machine. And the machine was beginning to treat them not as observers, but as a threat. Chapter 6, An Unnatural End. The following morning dawned cold and clear, but the mood at the ranch was heavy, with a palpable sense of frustration. The team gathered in the Ark, the silence punctuated by the quiet hum of servers and the clinking of coffee mugs. They were at a strategic impasse. Their multi-million-dollar drilling operation was being held hostage by a ghost in the machine, a conversation on a radio frequency they couldn't hear, and a barrier they couldn't see. "It's playing chess with us," Travis said, staring at the topographic map on the main screen, where the 610-meter radius of the bubble was now overlaid in a stark red circle. "Every move we make, it counters. We push. With technology, it pushes back with superior technology. We're trying to kick down a door when the occupant can simply dematerialize the wall." He felt a growing conviction that their direct assault approach was flawed. They were like cavemen throwing rocks at a stealth bomber. The bomber doesn't even have to acknowledge the rocks to be unaffected by them. Maybe it was time to stop studying the bomber and start studying its shadow on the ground. For years, he said, turning to the team, the stories from this ranch haven't just been about lights in the sky or buried objects. They've been about biological effects, cattle mutilations with surgical precision, unkillable wolf-like creatures, poltergeist activity inside the homesteads. We've been so focused on the hardware, we've ignored the software, the effect it has on the living. Before anyone could respond, the door to the Ark opened, and Thomas Winterton strode in his usual stoicism, replaced by a grim set to his jaw. He held up a hand to forestall any questions. "Travis, you need to come with me," he said, his voice low and serious. "I was doing my morning sweep of the property. Found something by Homestead 2. Something Eric asked. "What kind of something?" "A coyote, Thomas," replied, his gaze fixed on Travis. "A dead one. But it's wrong." A dead coyote was hardly news on a 512-acre ranch teeming with wildlife. But the word wrong coming from Thomas carried more weight than a dozen pages of scientific data. Travis grabbed his field kit, a sense of grim purpose settling over him. This was exactly what he had just been talking about, the shadow on the ground. Homestead 2 was one of the original ranch houses, a dilapidated structure that had been the site of intense paranormal claims by the previous owners. It stood silent and forlorn, a monument to the high strangeness of the property. About 50 yards from its crumbling porch, in a patch of dry grass, lay the coyote. From a distance, it looked peaceful, almost as if it were sleeping. It was a healthy-looking male, its coat thick and unmarked. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no obvious wounds from a predator or a hunter's bullet. "See what I mean?" Thomas murmured as they approached. "It just laid down and died." Travis knelt, pulling a pair of gloves from his kit. The first thing he noticed was the smell. There was none. A dead animal in the Utah sun should have already started to decompose to attract flies. But the air was clean, save for the scent of sagebrush. The insects were giving the carcass a wide berth. He pulled out a thermal camera and pointed it at the coyote. His breath caught in his throat. The coyote's body was a deep dark blue on the screen, a stark contrast to the sun-warmed ground around it, which glowed in shades of yellow and orange. "That's impossible," Travis whispered, showing the screen to Thomas. "It's cold, colder than ambient temperature. It should be at the very least the same temperature as the ground it's lying on. It's like it's being actively refrigerated." Next, he took out a tri-field meter which measured ambient electromagnetic fields. As he passed it over the coyote, the needle jumped into the red. A powerful localized EM field pulsed from the body, yet it dissipated to nothing just a few feet away. He made a decision. "We're taking it back. We need to do a full necropsy. Something killed this animal and it wasn't a predator." Back at the command center, they converted a sterile storage bay into a makeshift laboratory. Travis had called in a contact from the university doctor, Alana Chavez, a sharp, no-nonsense wildlife pathologist whom he had consulted on previous occasions. She had always maintained a healthy skepticism about the ranch, attributing most stories to misidentification and local folklore. When she arrived, her skepticism was still firmly in place. "So the legendary Skinwalker Ranch has a dead coyote," she said, pulling on a pair of latex gloves, her tone laced with dry amusement. "Let me guess, you think a UFO zapped it with a ray gun?" "I'm ruling nothing out," Travis replied, stone-faced. "Just tell me what you see." The external examination revealed nothing. No wounds, no broken bones. The animal's eyes were clear, its teeth and gums healthy. It was a perfectly normal coyote, except for the fact that it was dead, unnaturally cold, and radiating an EM field. The mystery only deepened when Dr. Chavez made the first incision. The moment her scalpel cut through the skin and into the abdominal cavity, she recoiled, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. "My God," she whispered. Travis leaned in. Where there should have been moist pink organs, there was a dry, gray, fibrous mass. The coyote's internal organs, the stomach, the liver, the intestines, were completely desiccated. They had the texture of ancient leather, as if they had been mummified for a century. Yet the skin, muscle tissue, and fur, just centimeters away, were perfectly preserved. "What could do this?" Chavez asked her, professional composure shattered, replaced by a scientist's bewildered curiosity. "It's like it was cooked from the inside out, with some kind of directed energy." "Microwaves, maybe. But the heat would have had to be phenomenal, and it would have cooked the whole animal. This is selective. Impossible." Travis's mind flashed to the array of signals they constantly monitored. They had detected powerful bursts of high-frequency microwave radiation on the ranch before, often coinciding with other strange events. Was this the result? A weapon that could boil a living creature from the inside out, leaving no external trace? Was this the surgical precision the old stories of cattle mutilation spoke of? He looked at the mummified organs, then at Dr. Chavez's stunned face. The shadow on the ground was real, and it was lethal. The phenomenon wasn't just a passive system to be studied. It was an active and potentially hostile force. As if on cue, a piercing alarm blared from the main command center next door. Eric Bard burst into the bay, his eyes wide. Travis, we have a massive energy spike, a broadband signal more powerful than anything we've ever recorded. Where's it coming from? Travis demanded, already stripping off his gloves. Eric pointed a trembling finger in the direction of the homesteads. That's the thing he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's not the triangle, it's not the mesa. It's coming from Homestead 2, right where you found the coyote. Another voice shouted from the ark. We've got movement on the thermal cameras. Something is moving inside the homestead. The machine wasn't just awake, it was on the move. And they had just brought a piece of its handiwork into their own headquarters. Chapter 7, The Haunting of Homestead 2. The klaxon's shriek tore through the command center, a raw electronic scream that vibrated in Travis's teeth. For a frozen moment, no one moved. The grisly scene on the necropsy table, the mummified organs of the coyote, the quiet horror on Dr. Chavez's face seemed to belong to a different, slower reality. Then instinct and training took over. Seal the lab, Travis yelled, his voice cutting through the alarm. Alana, get everything locked down, nobody in or out. Dr. Chavez, pale but resolute, nodded sharply, her scientific curiosity now eclipsed by a primal instinct for self-preservation. She moved to secure the bay door as Travis, Eric, and Thomas raced into the main room of the Ark. The central monitor was a chaotic symphony of screaming data. A massive spike dominated the spectrum analyzer, a jagged mountain range of energy across nearly all frequencies. On another screen, the live feed from a thermal camera pointed at Homestead 2 showed the dilapidated structure glowing with an unnatural intensity, not with heat, but with a cold, dark energy that made it stand out against the landscape like a bruise. There's the movement, the technician shouted, pointing to a magnified view of one of the homestead's grimy windows. A formless, shimmering distortion was visible through the glass, warping the image behind it. It moved with a fluid, non-physical grace that made the hairs on Travis's arms stand on end. That's not a person. Thomas stated, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm he always carried. That's not anything I've ever seen. Gear up, Travis commanded, his mind racing. Full sensor package. Eric, stay here. Keep a live comms link open and record everything. If that energy reading changes by a single decibel, you tell us. Thomas, you're with me. He looked around and saw Jim Royston, the stoic head of security, already pulling on a tactical vest. Jim, you too. I want eyes on all sides. The short drive to the homestead felt like an eternity. The air inside the truck grew thick with unspoken tension. They were armed with the pinnacle of modern scientific instrumentation, yet they felt profoundly vulnerable, like colonists venturing into a jungle whose predators were invisible and whose laws of nature were alien. As they approached, their equipment began to fail. First, the truck's digital dashboard flickered and died. Then, the encrypted radios hissed with static, the link to Eric dissolving into a waterfall of white noise. The tri-field meter in Travis's hand went haywire, its needle slamming against the far end of the scale with a violent crack. We're blind. Jim grunted, pulling the truck to a stop 100 yards from the house. And deaf. We go on anyway, Travis said, his voice tight. They exited the vehicle into a world that felt fundamentally wrong. The air hummed with a low, sub-audible frequency that he could feel in his bones, a deep, vibratory thrum that created a sense of profound unease and nausea. Even the quality of the light seemed different here, flatter, as if the sun's rays were struggling to penetrate an unseen medium. They approached the house in a tight formation, a scientist, a ranch manager, and a security chief, 3 points of a triangle, moving cautiously toward the heart of the anomaly. The front door of the homestead hung ajar a dark, gaping maw. From within, they could hear a sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like wood on wood. Travis held up a hand, signaling a halt. He peered through a dust-caked window. What he saw made him question his own sanity. The main room of the homestead was in a state of impossible motion. A wooden rocking chair in the corner was moving back and forth with frantic, violent energy, its runners carving grooves into the floorboards. In the center of the room, a cloud of smaller objects, dust motes, splinters of wood, dead insects, swirled in a miniature vortex suspended in midair. A rusted wood-burning stove slowly, silently began to levitate, rising a foot off the floor with a groan of protesting metal. The laws of gravity had been put on hold. It's a localized telekinetic event. Travis breathed his whisper barely audible over the hum in the air. A poltergeist. But the energy required to do this, it's off the scale. At the epicenter, Of the swirling chaos near the back wall, the air itself seemed to shimmer and boil like a heat haze on asphalt. It was the distortion they had seen on the thermal camera. It wasn't a creature. It was a place. A place where the fabric of their reality had worn thin. A window. That's the source, he said. He knew with a certainty that transcended data that they were looking at the entity that had killed the coyote. It wasn't an alien in a silver suit. It was a fundamental disruption in space-time, a living, breathing law of physics that did not belong in their universe. Jim, ever the pragmatist, raised his rifle, aiming at the shimmering nexus. Let's see what a 5.56 round does to it. No, Travis hissed, grabbing his arm. Don't. We have no idea how it will react. You could make it worse. You could be shooting a hole in reality itself. As if it had heard them, the shimmering intensified. The rocking chair stopped its violent motion and suddenly hurtled across the room, smashing into the wall next to the window where they stood, exploding into a shower of splintered wood. It was a warning shot. They scrambled back, taking cover behind the rusted shell of their truck as a second object, the levitating stove, crashed through the front wall of the homestead, propelled by an unseen force. It landed with a deafening clang just feet from where they had been standing. The message was clear: get out. As they fell back, their radios crackled back to life, the oppressive hum in the air receding behind them. Eric's frantic voice filled their earpieces. Travis, are you there? The energy signature just pulsed a massive increase. Then it started to drop back to baseline. What happened? It threw the furniture at us, Travis said, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was breathing heavily, not just from exertion, but from a deep existential shock. He looked from the now quiet homestead back towards the distant command center. And then the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He grabbed his spectrum analyzer and aimed it at the homestead. He saved the signature of the massive energy spike. Then he turned and sprinted back to the Ark, leaving the others behind. He burst into the makeshift lab where Dr. Chavez was still standing guard over the coyote's dissected corpse. The trifield meter, he gasped, the one we used on the body. Give me the data. Chavez, startled, quickly brought the readings up on a tablet. Travis plugged in his own device, overlaying the two signals, the powerful localized EM field from the dead coyote and the massive broadband energy spike from the entity inside Homestead 2. They were a perfect match. Not just similar, but a flawless harmonic resonance like two notes in a chord played by the same divine or demonic instrument. The truth washed over him in a cold wave. The entity hadn't just killed the coyote. It had imprinted itself upon it. The desiccated organs, the lingering EM field. It wasn't just the aftermath of an attack. It was a biological anchor, a tag. It knew, Travis whispered, looking from the screen to the dead animal. The moment we brought this body into our headquarters, it knew. The spike, the activity in the house, it was a reaction. It was looking for its property. The implications were staggering. The phenomenon wasn't confined to a location. It could attach itself to living things and by extension to them. They weren't just in a haunted place. They were at risk of becoming haunted themselves. The invisible wall of the bubble was no longer a perimeter to be studied from the outside. They had unknowingly carried a piece of the anomaly through the gate and brought it home. The shadow on the ground was not just a killer, it was a contagion, and they had just been exposed. Chapter 8, The Contagion Protocol. The silence in the makeshift lab was heavier than the densest lead shielding. The truth of Travis's discovery, the perfect chilling resonance between the dead animal and the violent entity, settled over the room like a shroud. The coyote on the steel table was no longer a biological specimen. It was a Trojan horse, a bomb. Dr. Chavez was the first to speak, her voice a strained whisper. Get it out of here. Out where Travis shot back his mind, already spinning through a dozen nightmarish scenarios. We can't just dump it. We don't know what would happen. What if the link is permanent? What if it acts as an anchor, allowing that thing to manifest wherever it is? He's right, Eric said, his face ashen as he joined them from the Ark's main room. We have a paraphysical contamination. We need to establish a protocol. The word protocol hung in the air, a familiar scientific term that sounded utterly inadequate for the situation. How do you write a protocol for a ghost that tags its victims? What containment measures do you use against a force that can throw a cast iron stove through a wall and mummify a living creature from the inside out? The atmosphere in the command center shifted from one of scientific inquiry to something closer to battlefield triage. A quiet, creeping paranoia began to infect the team. Every flicker of the lights, every burst of static over the comms was now suspect. Members of the team looked at each other with a new guarded apprehension. If the phenomenon could attach itself to a coyote, why not one of them? The conversation turned to the infamous hitchhiker effect, a dark legend whispered among paranormal researchers and UAP investigators for decades. It was the idea that the high strangeness of a place like Skinwalker Ranch wasn't always content to stay put. Investigators had reported returning home to find their lives upended by poltergeist activity, seeing shadowy figures in their homes, their families plagued by nightmares and unsettling synchronicities. It was a professional risk that everyone in the room was aware of, but it had always been an abstract concept, a spooky story told over beers. Now, with the tagged coyote lying just a few feet away, it was horribly, terrifyingly real. "I need to make a call," Thomas said abruptly, his voice rough with an emotion Travis had never heard from him before. Fear. He walked to a corner of the room, his back to the team, and spoke in low, hushed tones into his phone. Travis didn't need to hear the words to know he was talking to his family, telling them he might be late, checking to make sure everything was all right at home. The personal cost of their investigation had just become brutally apparent. "We have to contain the source," Jim Royston said, his voice a steady grounding presence in the rising tide of fear, the coyote. What do we do with it? An idea, both brilliant and reckless, began to form in Travis's mind. It was a desperate gambit born from the realization that they could no longer afford to be reactive. They had to go on the offensive. "We don't get rid of it," Travis said, thinking aloud. "We use it. We study the tag. We analyze the frequency, the modulation, the energy decay. We learn its signature so we can build a scanner to detect it. If this thing is a contagion, we need to develop the test that can find it." He looked at the grim faces around him, but more than that, if this entity can create a tag, maybe we can hijack it. Maybe we can create a beacon. "A beacon?" Eric asked, his eyes widening as he grasped the implication. "You want to talk to it?" "I want to track it," Travis clarified. "If we can replicate the resonant frequency, we could create a device that pings the entity that lets us see where it is, even when it's dormant. We could map its movements. We could predict its actions." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "We've been studying the storm. Now it's time to try and tag the lightning." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. It involved treating the coyote's body as a hazardous material, moving it to a specially constructed, electromagnetically shielded container. They would then attempt to reverse engineer the energy signature clinging to its cells. But the most dangerous part of the plan came next. They needed to see if the entity would tag a new target. They needed to set a trap. "We need bait," Travis said, "something biologically similar to the coyote. A pig carcass, maybe. We place it back at Homestead, too, right where we found the first one, and we surround it with every sensor we have. High-speed cameras, thermal imagers, spectrum analyzers, magnetometers, everything. We watch and we wait. We see if it takes the bait. We try to capture the tagging event in the act. And if it does," Dr. Chavez asked, her voice skeptical, but with a glint of the scientist's undeniable curiosity in her eyes. "What then?" "Then we have 2 data points," Travis said. "We can compare the signatures, and we'll know for sure that the incident with the coyote wasn't a fluke. We'll have the first ever reproducible experiment in paraphysics." The rest of the day was a blur of frantic activity. The team, their fear channeled into a shared desperate purpose, worked with feverish intensity. A lead-line containment box was fabricated. The pig carcass was procured from a local farm. A web of sensors and cameras was meticulously prepared and calibrated. As dusk fell, Thomas and Jim, clad in full-body hazmat suits, as a precaution, carefully transported the new bait to the designated spot outside Homestead 2. The house stood silent and dark, seemingly inert, but no one was fooled. They were placing a sacrifice on an altar, hoping to draw out a god or a demon. Back in the Ark, the team gathered around the monitors, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Each screen showed a different view of the bait, a thermal image, a magnetic field map, a live video feed. They were peering into the dark, waiting for the monster to show itself. Hours passed. The only activity was the slow cooling of the pig carcass on the thermal display. The initial adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a weary tension. Maybe it wouldn't work. Maybe the entity was too intelligent or too alien to fall for such a simple trap. Then it happened. Not at the homestead, but in the lab. A low pulsing alarm sounded from the bay where the coyote's body was now secured in its lead-lined box. A single red light flashed on the containment unit's control panel. Eric's fingers flew across his keyboard. "What is it?" Travis demanded. "It's the EM field," Eric said, his voice trembling. "The signature from the coyote. It's changing. It's pulsing. It's responding to something." On the main monitor, the jagged mountain range of the energy signature began to shift its peaks and valleys, reconfiguring into a new complex pattern. It was no longer a static signal. It was a waveform. It was data. "It's not just pulsing," Travis breathed, staring at the screen in disbelief. The pattern was intricate, non-random. It looked like a carrier wave, like a signal designed to convey information. "My God," he whispered, "it's not a tag. It's a transmitter." Chapter 9, The Devil's Duet. The word transmitter echoed in the sterile confines of the Ark, rewriting every assumption they had ever made. A tag was passive, a marker left behind. A transmitter was active, intelligent, and purposeful. It implied a conversation, and they were standing in the middle of it. A transmitter for what Jim Royston's pragmatic voice cut through the stunned silence. "And what is it talking to?" As if in answer, a new alarm blared, this one from the array of sensors focused on Homestead 2. On the main video feed, the pig carcass lay still under the cold infrared gaze of the camera. But on the other screens, the data was screaming. Massive energy spike at the bait site. The technician monitoring the feeds called out, "Localized EM field off the charts," and oh my God. He pointed a trembling finger at the thermal camera display. The pig carcass, which had been steadily cooling, was suddenly glowing with an intense internal heat. But it wasn't the uniform heat of a fire. It was a complex web-like pattern of energy that pulsed just beneath the skin, a ghastly incandescent circulatory system. Then just as quickly as it appeared, the glow vanished. The pig was once again just a cold, inert shape in the dirt. But they all knew it wasn't. The trap had been sprung. The bait had been taken. It did it. Dr. Chavez breathed, her scientific detachment completely gone, replaced by pure awe. It tagged the second one. "It's not just a tag." Travis repeated, his eyes glued to the spectrum analyzer, where the signal from the coyote in the containment box was now engaged in a complex, terrifying dance. "Look." He pointed to the screen. The waveform pulsing from the coyote's body was no longer a monologue. A second signal had appeared, a perfect mirror image of the first broadcasting from the direction of Homestead 2. The two signals intertwined on the screen, weaving in and out of phase, their peaks and valleys rising and falling in a structured call and response pattern. It was a duet. A conversation between two dead things orchestrated by an invisible alien intelligence. "It's using them as relays," Eric said, his fingers flying across the keyboard trying to make sense of the flood of data. "The entity doesn't have to be at the homestead anymore. It's established a network. It's using the biological tissue as a biological modem." The true horror of the hitchhiker effect slammed into Travis with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just that the phenomenon could follow you home, it could turn you into a node in its network. It could use you to broadcast its signal, to extend its reach to listen. The stories of families plagued by poltergeists, of investigators whose lives fell apart, were they unwitting carriers? Were their bodies broadcasting a signal that invited the chaos in? "We have to decode it," Travis said, his voice urgent. "Eric, can you isolate the carrier wave? Can you filter out the noise and find the core signal?" "I'm trying," Eric replied, his face illuminated by the cascade of code on his screen. "The complexity is immense. It's not a simple sine wave. It's quantum modulated, encrypted with a key that seems to change based on the local magnetic field. It's the most sophisticated signal I've ever seen." For the next hour, the Ark was a hive of focused, desperate activity. They were no longer just paranormal investigators. They were cryptographers racing to break an alien code. They looped the signal, analyzed its frequencies, and applied every decryption algorithm they had. It was like trying to catch smoke with a net. The signal was adaptive, intelligent, almost alive. It seemed to anticipate their efforts, shifting its encryption protocol the moment they got close to a solution. "It knows we're listening." Travis murmured, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "It's playing with us." He stepped away from the frenetic energy of the decryption effort and looked at the bank of monitors displaying the live feeds from the ranch. His gaze fell upon the screen showing the view from a camera on the mesa overlooking the entire basin, and he saw it. High above the ranch, a single brilliant point of light hung motionless in the night sky. It wasn't a star or a satellite. It pulsed with a soft internal luminescence, and as Travis watched, a second identical light appeared beside it. Then a third. "Eric," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "put the Mesa camera on the main screen." Eric complied, and a collective gasp went through the room. A triangle of lights now hung in the sky, a silent celestial audience to their frantic efforts below. At that exact moment, the signal from the two carcasses on the ground changed. The complex encrypted duet ceased. It was replaced by a single pure resonant tone broadcast from both the coyote and the pig simultaneously. The waveform on the spectrum analyzer resolved into a perfect simple sine wave. "It's broadcasting a new signal," Eric said, his voice filled with disbelief. It's a targeting frequency." A new sound filled the Ark, not from their alarms or their equipment, but from outside. A low, powerful hum, like a 1,000-ton transformer coming online, vibrated through the concrete walls. It grew steadily in volume, a sound that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Travis looked from the pure, simple signal on the screen to the triangle of lights in the sky. He finally understood. The coyote and the pig were never the targets. They were the amplifiers, the transmitters. The entire frantic episode at the homestead, the tagging, the duet. It was all a prelude. It was the system powering up, calibrating its instruments, and taking aim. The pure resonant tone was a lock-on. "They're not talking to each other anymore," Travis said, his eyes wide with a terrible final realization. "They're talking to whatever is up there." He looked at the faces of his team, etched with fear and the pulsating glow of the monitors. And we're standing right in the middle of the X. Chapter 10, The Glass Storm. The X wasn't a location anymore, it was a state of being. For a long, silent moment, the team in the Ark was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to run and the horrified realization that there was nowhere to run to. The low, bone-jarring hum from outside intensified, pressing against the concrete walls until the entire structure vibrated in sympathetic resonance. It felt less like a sound and more like the physical pressure of an immense, unseen object settling down on top of them. On the main screen, the triangle of lights in the sky began to change. They brightened their soft luminescence, sharpening into a trio of brilliant diamond-hard points. Then from the geometric center of the triangle, a fourth, much fainter light began to resolve as if a lens were focusing an impossible energy. "Eric, what's our total energy reading across the property?" Travis yelled, his voice tight and strained over the growing din. "It's not possible," Eric stammered, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at his console. "The numbers, they don't make sense. It's not just EM or radiation. The gravimeters are going crazy. We're seeing localized fluctuations in the gravitational constant. The atomic clocks are desyncing. Time itself is bending around us." The attack, when it came, was not one of fire and force. It was far more insidious. It was an assault on perception itself. A wave of profound disorientation washed over the team. The solid floor of the Ark seemed to tilt beneath their feet, and a wave of vertigo sent several technicians stumbling against their consoles. The air grew thick and heavy, like trying to breathe underwater, and a high-pitched, piercing whine began to echo inside their skulls, a sound that had no external source. "What's happening?" Dr. Chavez cried out, clutching her head. Travis fought to stay upright, his scientific mind struggling to categorize the sensory chaos. It felt like the world was being put through a filter, every physical law suddenly becoming a variable in an insane equation. On the monitors, the live camera feeds began to distort. The image of the mesa warped as if seen through a heat haze, the distant rock formations seeming to ripple and flow like liquid. Then came the glass. It started at the edges of their vision. Tiny shimmering fractals of light, like shards of a broken mirror, began to appear in the air around them. They multiplied rapidly, filling the room with a silent crystalline storm. They drifted on unseen currents, refracting the light from the monitors into 1,000 dazzling, disorienting rainbows. They were beautiful, and they were utterly terrifying. Travis reached out a trembling hand to touch one. As his finger passed through the shimmering shape, he felt no physical sensation, but a jolt of pure, unadulterated information flooded his mind. He saw an image, not with his eyes, but directly in his consciousness, a spiral galaxy, ancient and vast, its arms turning in a slow cosmic dance. Then another, a complex geometric symbol that pulsed with an inner light and seemed to hum with an alien meaning. Then a torrent of them, 1,000,000 years of unhuman history, a library of impossible knowledge, all compressed into a single agonizing microsecond. He staggered back, crying out in pain, clutching his temples as his brain reeled from the psychic overload. He saw others on the team reacting similarly, some collapsing to their knees, others staring blankly at the walls, their eyes wide with the same cosmic horror he had just witnessed. The entity wasn't shooting at them, it was showing them. It was trying to communicate, but its language was pure physics. Its syntax was the geometry of space-time, and its sheer volume was enough to shatter a human mind. The deep hum outside reached an unbearable crescendo. The crystalline storm inside the ark spun faster and faster, a whirlwind of light and raw data. The targeting frequency being broadcast by the dead animals hit a perfect resonant peak. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The hum vanished. The pressure on the building lifted. The piercing whine in their heads faded to nothing. The storm of glass fractals dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ozone and the ghost of a billion alien thoughts. Silence. On the main screen, the sky was empty. The three lights were gone. For a full minute, the only sound in the ark was the ragged, desperate gasps of the team members as they pulled themselves back from the brink of sensory annihilation. They were alive. They were physically unharmed. But they had been fundamentally changed. They had looked into the abyss, and for a terrifying moment, the abyss had poured itself into them. Damage Report Jim Royston's voice was the first to break the fragile silence, a gravelly anchor of normalcy in a sea of madness. Slowly, shakily, the technicians returned to their stations. The reports came in each one stranger than the last. All systems are green. No physical damage to the ark or any external sensors. Gravitational and temporal readings have returned to baseline. But the data logs from the event are gone. Not corrupted, not erased. It's like they were never there. There's a hole in our records exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds long. Wait, Eric said, his voice hushed. Not all of it is gone. He pointed to the spectrum analyzer. The targeting frequency was gone, but something else remained. A faint residual signal pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a fading heartbeat. Where's that coming from? Travis asked, his own heart pounding in his chest. Eric's fingers moved over the keys, triangulating the source. The result appeared on the screen, a blinking red dot on a schematic of the ark. It wasn't coming from the containment unit holding the Coyote. It wasn't coming from any of their equipment. The signal was originating from the center of the main operations floor, from the exact spot where they had all just stood weathering the glass storm. It's not coming from a device, Eric whispered, his face pale. The source is biological, and it's not singular, it's diffuse. It's coming from all of us. The horrifying truth settled upon them. The entity hadn't missed. The targeting frequency had found its mark with perfect, devastating precision. The information overloaded the glass storm. It wasn't an attack. It was an upload? A baptism? An inoculation? The hitchhiker was no longer a theory. They were the hitchhikers. The contagion was in their blood, in their cells, broadcasting a faint, silent signal out into the cosmos. They hadn't just studied the phenomenon. They had become part of it. The X was no longer on the ground. It was inside them. It was the silence of a tomb, the silence of men and women who had just been read their own incomprehensible epitaph. They were no longer scientists studying an anomaly. They were the anomaly itself, walking, talking, and breathing the very phenomenon they had sought to understand. The line between observer and observed had been obliterated. A wave of primal, instinctive revulsion swept through the room. Team members took an involuntary step back from one another, their faces a mixture of fear and a new terrible suspicion. If the signal was coming from all of them, was it the same in everyone? Was Travis standing a few feet away, now a potential threat? Was the person next to you a carrier of a cosmic contagion, the camaraderie that had been forged through years of shared strangeness, fractured in an instant, replaced by the isolating terror of the deeply personal unknown? Nobody leaves this room, Jim Royston's voice boomed, cutting through the rising panic. He wasn't asking. He was giving the only order that made sense. This facility is now under full quarantine. The word quarantine was both a comfort and a death sentence. The ark, their shield against the ranch's madness, had just become their cage. We have to scan ourselves. Dr. Chavez said, her medical training kicking in a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. Blood work, EEGs, full-body MRI. We need a baseline. A baseline for what Travis retorted the futility of their situation crashing down on him. How do you test for this? What's the control group for having a galactic library uploaded into your DNA? We don't have the tools. We don't even have the right branch of science. He was right, and they all knew it. Their multi-million-dollar array of sensors designed to probe the external world was useless now. The mystery wasn't outside them anymore. It was in their blood, their bones, their neurons. The weight of this new reality settled on each of them differently. Thomas Winterton sagged against a console, his face pale as thoughts, a million miles away at home with his family. He reached for his phone, then stopped his hand hovering over the device. What could he say? Honey, I won't be home for dinner. I seem to have become a low-frequency biological transmitter for an unknown intelligence. He was a walking contamination zone. The most dangerous thing he could do for the people he loved was to go near them. Eric, meanwhile, was already lost in the data, his fear channeled into the only thing he knew, analysis. The signal isn't uniform, he said, his voice a low, obsessive murmur. It's a carrier wave, yes, but it's modulated. There's data embedded in it. A lot of it. He brought the waveform up on the main screen. It looked like a chaotic jumble of noise, but as he applied a series of complex filters, a pattern began to emerge. It was a fractal, a design of infinite complexity and self-similarity, a clear hallmark of intelligent design. The information from the glass storm Travis breathed, stepping closer to the screen. It wasn't just a psychic blast, it was a data transfer. It didn't just show us the library, it downloaded the card catalog. For the next few hours, a grim new routine was established. The team was divided into two groups. Dr. Chavez, assisted by a pale but resolute medic, began drawing blood and prepping what limited medical diagnostic equipment they had. The other group, led by Travis and Eric, focused on the signal, treating their own bodies as the subject of the most important experiment of their lives. They discovered the signal was strongest when they were in close proximity, as if their individual fields were resonating, amplifying each other into a more coherent whole. They were a biological array, a human antenna. Working together, they managed to isolate a single repeating data packet within the signal's fractal noise. It was a complex string of numbers and symbols that didn't correspond to any known mathematical constant or physical law. It's not math and it's not language, Eric said after hours of fruitless attempts at decryption. It's something else. A blueprint, maybe? Or a map. As Eric spoke those words, a memory surfaced in Travis's mind, a fragment from the overwhelming torrent of information he'd received during the glass storm. It was one of the geometric symbols, a complex, multi-layered diagram that had pulsed with an inner light. On instinct, he sketched it from memory on a digital whiteboard. This, he said, his voice trembling with a dawning, terrifying excitement. I saw this. Eric, can you model this symbol as a data filter? Use its geometry as the decryption key? Eric stared at the symbol, his eyes widening. He began to type furiously, translating Travis's sketch into a set of algorithmic commands. The powerful computers of the Ark were applying the strange alien geometry to the repeating data packet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single line of text appeared on the screen, translated from the alien code into perfect, simple English. It was a question. Where are you? The air left the room in a collective rush. The signal wasn't a passive echo. It wasn't a card catalog. It was a handshake, a login prompt, a query from the system they were now a part of asking for their location. Before anyone could react, before they could even process the monumental implication of a two-way conversation, a second line of text appeared below the first. This one was not a question. It was a statement, a signature. We are already here. At that exact moment, every screen in the Ark showing an external camera feed went black, all of them except one. The single feed that remained was from the camera inside the sealed lead-lined containment box, the one pointed at the mummified remains of the coyote. The creature's eyes, dry and dead, for days were now glowing with a soft blue light.